almost going to jump in because I was sitting in CDF's job. I was almost about to say, I think it's line of questions.
Except then you realise it was done with questions.
That's a problem I don't need. Leave it with him. He's a big boy.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? Welcome back for the first session of the conference. Can I ask you to check your mobile phones again, please? Set to silent. We are very privileged this morning to have all three service chiefs address the conference. Unusual to have all three in the same room at the same time outside of Russell. So all three service chiefs will be speaking, and then we'll have time for 15 minutes of Q&A on completion. I'm not going to go through the biographies of the service chiefs. You have those available in your conference packs. So without further ado, I'll ask the Chief of Navy to address the conference.
Thanks, Justin. Before I get into the formal remarks, I'd like to acknowledge that there are a number of people here today who are recognised in our Australia Day honours list last week. And I'd like to congratulate them all for their respective achievements and for receiving national recognition in this way. I do want to single out one person, and he is Professor Martin Semenyi, Director of the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong. And Martin, on behalf of the Royal Australian Navy, thank you very much for your efforts in the fields of ocean policy and ocean law. You've been a very good friend of the Navy's over the years, and you have guided many a naval officer in their pursuit of postgraduate studies in these fields. And your appointment as a member of the Order of Australia is fitting of your substantial contribution. Congratulations, Martin. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome and express my sincere thanks to my fellow service chiefs, David Morrison and Geoff Brown, for taking the time to come and participate in this session this morning. In 2010, our predecessors did something similar, and I think it made an enormous impact. I thought it was a great initiative at the time, and I was very keen to see it repeated, primarily because there is very little that Australia does militarily that is not fundamentally a joint endeavour. The maritime domain, more than any other, relies on joint effects to realise the objectives we seek to achieve. As the Chiefs, we do represent the interests of our respective combat arms of the Australian Defence Force, but we do that with an inherently joint outlook. The joint journey for Australia was initially largely one of financial necessity. Our scale meant we could not afford to duplicate capabilities that were used exclusively in only one domain or by one organisation. As we progressed, it became even more clear, as it has to many other defence organisations around the world, that the power of a joint combat approach has its own compelling logic. We have managed to move through a number of phases in our joint development journey, to the point where you now have a single service chief arguing for a capability for another service because of its inherent value to the joint force, even at times at the potential expense of another desired capability for their own service. I think when you reach that point, you know you are well along the path to a truly jointly focused warfighting team. Today, though, I do want to talk about the theme of this conference, the naval contribution to national security and prosperity. Why, in an island continent, do we feel the need to have a conference with this theme? After a couple of centuries of absolute reliance on the sea for both our security and our prosperity, how is this not deeply embedded into our national psyche? Well, firstly, we're not alone in facing this dilemma. Our British friends coined the phrase sea blindness a number of years ago to describe what was then considered a lamentable lack of understanding by the British public of the sea and the importance of the Navy. The term has been picked up in other places, such as India, and it's fair to say it's a condition that we suffer from here in Australia. It is confounding that many Australians observe an array of merchant ships at anchor off Australian ports such as Newcastle, but do not instinctively make the connection to our national wealth. Of course, compounding that is that much of our high-value merchant traffic operates in our sparsely populated northwest coast or other regional areas, largely unseen by the public. But just as unrecognised are the oil tankers that bring the petroleum on which our internal economy depends. The truth is that most seaborne activity is invisible to the average citizen, and the relationship between the assured use of the ocean and our national prosperity, indeed our national survival, is not something that penetrates the consciousness of most. Perhaps running the supermarket shelves test is the best way to make the point. Take everything off the shelf in a supermarket that has in some way been reliant on sea transport and see what's left. Partly this problem exists because of the nature of maritime work. Much of what maritime industries, shipping, fishing and offshore resource exploitation, as well as what navies do, happens out of sight of land. All too often, it's also out of mind. This presents a perennial challenge for all navies, just as it does for our maritime industry. We have had a recent lesson in the tragic loss of the Italian cruise liner Costa Concordia, and the graphic images of the half-sunken hull gained much more attention than had the day-to-day activities of a vast worldwide industry carrying millions of people every year with a previously good safety record. At its core, it is our Navy's contribution to good order and discipline at sea that is critical. Our ability to use the sea safely for our own national interest and vitally for our mutual benefit is the key issue. There is very much a national dimension to this, of course. After all, today, from my perspective, we're talking about our economy. But the importance of alliances, partnerships and coalitions in the maritime domain is fundamental, given that we are all reliant on global trading routes which no single navy can police or control. In that respect, I am very pleased to see the large number of overseas delegations here and Chief of Navy counterparts. Your contribution to this debate is vitally important. The principal intellectual construct that we use when describing this challenge is the notion of sea lines of communication, or SLOCs. Historically, this is exactly what they were, the routes that connected nations and empires on which people, material and information was carried. It was, of course, for maritime nations often the only means of communicating. Today, the only real sea lines of communication are the undersea cables that carry internet traffic and e-commerce. The traditional surface SLOCs are really lines of trade, or, in keeping with this conference, lines of prosperity. One thing we might ask ourselves this week is whether SLOC as a term actually does us any favours in articulating Navy's contribution to security and prosperity. Is it time to find a more contemporary term that better describes what we're talking about? I see here a parallel to the way in which, for a while in the dot-com boom, the old economy was neglected and decried in favour of the emerging wonders of the digital universe. Inevitably, the realisation had to come that those who operate in the electronic world must have a material existence as well. When people now talk of communications, particularly the young, the conscious and unconscious association is with electronic transmission and the speed of light. We need to find new ways of describing the maritime world of ships and cargoes and our utter dependence upon their safety and movement that succeed in conveying the realities involved of mass, scale and time. If I may put out a challenge to present-day thinkers and writers on maritime strategy, it is for them to devise arguments that can get this message to the national audiences of 2012. But sticking to current nomenclature, SLOC security really endures as the main maritime game. Freedom of navigation along those SLOCs remains one of the central tenets that many of us hold dear. Now, when I use the term freedom of navigation, I use it in its broadest sense. It is not simply a discussion regarding nation-state interpretations regarding maritime jurisdictions, but the ability to navigate on the global commons, on lawful business, in lawful ways, without interference. Through the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, we've developed a legal architecture to help us manage this. From a naval perspective, the maintenance of our security and prosperity is achieved through three key activities: sea control, sea denial, and maritime power projection. And going back to my opening comments, for any small to medium-sized defence force, these are not the purview of the Navy alone. For some reason, we have not been good at publicly articulating these elements of naval strategy. All too often, they are seen as independent activities rather than highly interdependent ones. And this is where much of the commentary on strategic maritime issues comes unhinged, particularly that which focuses on the balance required in our overall force structure. Notwithstanding, sea control is the primary naval task in SLOC security. It spans all levels of operational intensity and peacetime constabulary tasks, where it is as much an interagency activity as a naval one, through to the high-end warfighting end of the spectrum. It is time-consuming because it is largely about creating conditions for the use of the sea, and that requires sustained presence. It applies equally to our major trading routes, to maritime choke points, and in our own EEZ, around our critical offshore infrastructure and resources. Sea control is often localised either geographically or temporally. It's about allowing the use of the sea area involved, not dominance of it just for its own sake. But what it needs to be effective is a balanced force structure. Successive Australian governments have endorsed a balanced force structure for the ADF, and in particular for the Navy. There are those who argue for more specialised forms of force structure, and often these are built around denial capabilities. The reason these pundits have never got sustained attention, nor their ideas much traction, is that their proposals introduce additional and, I believe, unacceptable levels of strategic risk, and they fail to understand the interconnected nature of these maritime concepts. For example, many components of our Air Force's force structure have a key role in sea control, particularly the MPAs, airborne early warning control aircraft, tankers, the fighter force, and in the future, high-altitude, long-endurance UAVs. They are all a key part of the force structure balance required for effective sea control. Sea denial is, of course, an important option to have available strategically, but alone this approach cannot guarantee our SLOCs and thus cannot underwrite our national security. For a maritime nation such as Australia, where there is a need to use the sea and not just deny its use, sea denial is in fact very much a concept that operates at the higher end of the operational intensity spectrum, and one that in our strategic circumstances would invariably be used in conjunction with sea control. Again, it is not solely conducted by the Navy. Both Air Force and Special Forces have distinct roles. Sea denial is also not solely in naval terms about submarines either, nor is it purely or necessarily a defensive strategy. Furthermore, offensive sea denial against an adversary in that adversary's backyard requires assets with the appropriate reach and endurance to conduct it. Maritime power projection is a critical capability for the ADF, particularly in its regional role of contributing to the security of stability in the Pacific and East Timor. At its heart is the delivery of force from the sea, be that through naval bombardment or the use and support of land forces in an amphibious activity. Power projection does not always involve the use of military forces in a hard power way. HADR, of course, is a manifestation of the same foundation techniques and capabilities used for harder edge power projection missions in getting capabilities where they are needed and when they are needed. All three services play vital roles in the maritime power projection, but Army and Navy in particular must operate hand in glove in this domain. What we are seeing now is a fairly rapid maturation of a relationship that has been developing over the last 30 years. The catalyst for this maturation is, of course, the quantum leap in capability that we will see with the arrival of the LHDs in 2014. At this conference 2 years ago, the then Chief of Army gave a very clear indication of where Army was headed. The current Chief has taken that vision and started to turn it into reality with the recent announcement that the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment will in effect form the nucleus of an amphibious battle group. Through the Joint Amphibious Council, which the Chief of Army and I co-chair, we are seeing significant movement towards where we need to be for 2014. The LHD will truly be a joint capability, and their introduction into service is already testing us on a number of levels. In Navy, the worst thing we could do is to think that this was a routine introduction of new capability and that we know boats. There is a level of complexity in the LHD that we have not seen since operating the carrier Melbourne. There are very few of us left still serving who served in Melbourne, and those of us who are were very, very junior officers or junior sailors at the time. Some would say clueless. I would like to characterise it as inexperienced. HMAS Choules, our newest warship, is a magnificent capability bridge to the LHD. She brings with her a dock and electric pod propulsion, something we can gain experience with over the next couple of years in the lead up to the first LHD. Until then, both Choules and Tobruk will play an important part in preparing both Navy and Army for this transition. But the tendrils of the maritime power projection issue extend much more deeply into the Defence Organisation. And that is why the Vice Chief has the task as the Joint Capability Authority of making sure that all the other aspects that will make the ADF amphibious capability work are in train. We as an ADF senior leadership group are all very focused on ensuring that the transition to the new construct is very smooth. But what we must not do is think that this is the sole focus for the ADF's endeavours over the decade. The amphibious capability is most certainly a game changer. It will challenge the way we've operated amphibious capabilities in the past. It will change the way which we train and operate as an ADF. But it is not the only capability transition challenge that we face. There are several other major maritime capability developments that will require a deal of effort. In the maritime context, and for Navy in particular, the introduction of the air warfare destroyers, a key sea control and power projection capability, will also bring with it significant challenges as we get back into the area air defence game. The interaction with Air Force's Wedgetail and eventually F-35 capability will be critical if we are to optimise the joint effect that is available for us. More specifically for Navy, the development of the offshore combatant vessel over the coming years will challenge some pretty entrenched positions and thoughts. Of course, the vigorous debate we have seen over the last few months regarding the future submarine is but a taster of the national level challenges that lie ahead. All this falls coincident with our single greatest focused effort on rebuilding and reinvigorating our engineering capabilities and technical workforce, and restoring the importance of technical integrity into our day-to-day business. We are doing this through embedding a unifying seaworthiness construct and ensuring that our culture continues to develop under the New Generation Navy Change Program to what is required to attract and retain our people in a contemporary warfighting Navy. I know that many of the other navies and services represented here face a similar range of complex challenges, and I think that we have much to learn from each other. At the end of the day, the best way for us to maintain our collective security and prosperity is for us to understand each other's needs and interests. To do that, we need to talk and interact. We need to exercise together and operate together on the global commons. We need to continue to embrace the notion of maritime security as a collective maritime endeavour, as we have seen around the Horn of Africa. There may be different models that work there in achieving that purpose, but all of us share the same aim. Underpinning this is the continued importance of the development and maintenance of maritime domain awareness and our ability to see and understand what is happening around our coasts and out at sea. Technology is clearly becoming an enabler for improvements in MDA for all. We're now really starting to bump up against other constraints which are more human in nature, the need to know versus the need to share. It's a significant challenge for us, but one that we can overcome. So I've tried to attempt to set the scene from an Australian naval perspective, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other service chiefs' contribution in a minute. There are some fascinating sessions planned for the remainder of the conference, and I hope that they generate some robust and constructive discussion and help us all better articulate to our respective nations the importance of the naval contribution to security and prosperity. I'd now like to ask the Chief of Army, Lieutenant General David Morrison, to give his remarks. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, to you, Ray, first of all, my thanks for the invitation to speak at such a prestigious event as this one. I think that being able to share the stage with you and with the Chief of Air Force, Geoff Brown, says a great deal about the importance that all three services place on this event and, by implication, on joint operations within a maritime strategy. I'd like to think that I'm as humble as the next bloke, or at least as humble as the next service chief, but if I may be permitted a small degree of immodesty, can I say that you have got me on something of a roll today? Late last year, I had the chance to visit our servicemen and women who are performing a magnificent job in Timor-Leste. Over the course of about 3 days, I got the opportunity to see many of our service personnel, and on the final evening before I returned to Australia, I went out and had dinner with the Rifle Company, which is largely a reserve company, an Army Reserve company that's operating out of Dili. I got the chance with Minister Clare to speak to the company as a group and take a number of questions about a range of interests that they had, and then I shared dinner with a couple of the sections. I had a host junior NCO, a reservist from Newcastle, who at the end of the evening, as I was saying goodbye, shook me by the hand and said, "Well, look, that was just great, sir. You really surprised me. You seem to know a fair bit about the Army." With that ringing endorsement, it was the fact that the descriptor really surprised that took me somewhat aback. I think what's clear from that, though, is that it's no small part of my job to take opportunities such as this to be as clear as possible about Army's focus and how it contributes to national defence and security. So let me make two definitive statements as a prelude to the main theme of my address today. Firstly, Army needs its ADF more than it needs its Army, its Navy or its Air Force if it's to possess robust military options now and into the future. It's about being a joint force, and Army gets that. Secondly, the foundation of Australia's national security is a maritime strategy. This has been articulated and re-articulated in a series of white papers. But a maritime strategy is not a naval strategy. It's a joint, indeed interagency and possibly coalition strategy, and Army has an essential role to play if that strategy is to continue to have relevance in the coming decades. My purpose today is to describe what I see as Army's role in that strategy and to provide an insight into how we are marrying our doctrinal and force development planning to government's direction and guidance in order to be capable of executing the strategic tasks that are allocated to us. At its heart, Army needs to be able to deploy force elements by air and by sea with the requisite joint military capabilities to meet operational challenges that those force elements will encounter, sustain that commitment until acceptable conditions are achieved, rotate the forces if the operations prove to be protracted, and then redeploy them to home locations. While this has been always the major role that we have played during our history, such a capacity has not always been resident in the Army of the day, and nor has it been necessarily achieved with real effectiveness and efficiency. Nonetheless, the operational lessons that have been learnt by this generation of soldiers, particularly over the last 12 years, allied to the introduction into service of a range of very significant joint capabilities that will occur in the next 2 decades, is going to ensure that Army has the potential to be a key contributor to achieving national security through the application of a maritime strategy. For the remainder of my address, I want to focus on how that potential will be realised. The Australian Army's reputation and identity was forged at Gallipoli, one of the most famous amphibious operations of the 20th century, which, while bold in conception, lacked much in execution. It's uncontroversial that Australia's grand strategic practice since Federation has been contributing joint military forces to coalition operations to support favourable global order maintained by the dominant maritime power of the day, in turn Britain, followed by the United States. The relatively small size of the Army at times encourages an almost tactical level thinking about its employment, when in reality, Australian statecraft has made frequent and diverse use of land forces over the past century. For a middle power like Australia, the use of strategic land power is not so much related to size and mass, but rather to effect and objective. When judged against these criteria, it's clear that Australian policy has, since 1942, used elements of land power for strategic purposes more frequently than any other military instrument, particularly in our primary operating environment. In the light of that history, it's somewhat surprising that we are having to learn and relearn amphibious operations again, pretty much from first principles. The explanation for this is, I believe, that for much of the history that we have shared, the three services developed closer ties with the equivalent services of our allies than they did with other elements of the Australian Defence Force. Now, this has not been entirely our fault. Governments of all persuasions have, quite appropriately, provided niche contributions all over the globe in support of our alliance arrangements. More often than not, this has involved penny packeting of niche forces, with the result that we have developed both operational and joint expertise, but not necessarily with each other. However, the strategic shock of East Timor in 1999 threw us back together, and since that time I believe we have made great strides in developing joint concepts, joint doctrine, and, most difficult of all, a truly joint mindset and culture. But we all recognise that we face enormous challenges in developing the forces provided by our strategic guidance and the doctrine and command and control arrangements to effectively employ them across a spectrum of operations. In that respect, Ray, I am indebted to you for the valuable insight from your speech to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute last month. You cautioned Navy against complacency and warned that the introduction of a new amphibious capability is anything but routine, and you've restated that today, especially in the light of the evolution of a frigate culture within your service over the past 3 decades. For my part, I am concerned that Army has become mired in the belief that the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal Australian Air Force only provide strategic lift. This is incorrect. It limits our ability to conceive of entry by air and sea operations in anything but the most permissive environment. I have echoed your warning to my own service, Ray. We cannot afford to think of the LHDs as merely a transport capability. Rather, they are an integral part of the combat system with unique and unprecedented command and control and sustainment challenges. Indeed, the acquisition of the LHDs represent not only far greater technical complexity in the operating systems that they will deliver, that we in the Defence Force have previously experienced, but it will introduce a far greater complexity into joint training, scheduling and integration across and between all three services than we've been able to achieve in the past. It means that all parts of defence activity are going to be affected and will need to adjust accordingly. But we, Army, are up for the challenge. I want to own the solutions and have indicated on this side the price of my buy-in. If I could have the slide, please. I should point out that that piece of PowerPoint magic took someone of my age about an hour. Anyone 20 years younger would have achieved it in about 3 seconds. And while it makes a visual impact and is probably good for a laugh, it is also making a deadly serious statement of intent. The LHDs are a joint asset, and they will serve as an integral part of a true maritime strategy that this country needs for its defence and security needs of the future. Lord Edward Grey once eloquently argued that the British Army needed to be a projectile fired by the Navy, a quote popularised by Admiral Jackie Fisher and often mistakenly ascribed to him. But I'm very fond of it. It provides an aiming mark for me and my force developers as we seek to create the land component of a joint amphibious capability. The weapons system of the new LHDs is in fact the embarked force, and the true capability is the joint effect delivered through Army, Navy and Air Force within the amphibious task group. In the remainder of my time, I'd just like to outline where Army is in the development of an amphibious capability and some of the hurdles that we are having to negotiate during my time as its chief. The key internal factor that will determine Army force generation are the changes to our brigade structures under Plan Bathsheba. And it's no coincidence that the Minister for Defence publicly endorsed this plan at the same time last year in Perth that he took part in the commissioning of HMAS Choules. The two are inextricably linked. Under Plan Bathsheba, the Army is developing multi-rolled combat brigades. This is an overdue development. For too long, we maintained single capabilities within our brigades with deleterious effects on our force generation and our career planning cycles. It was inefficient and probably harmed our retention as well. The development of a standard multi-role brigade will enable Army to reach the objectives set in the 2000 White Paper for us to be able to provide a brigade for sustained operations within our primary operating environment. It also allows us to develop forces of a combat weight commensurate with the level of threat in the modern battle space. The force generation implications of this are profound, and the remainder of the ADF is going to have to be able to stand with us if we are to undertake sustained joint operations, both in the littoral approaches to Australia and throughout our immediate neighbourhood. Much of the responsibility for raising, training and certifying land forces capable of amphibious operations falls squarely within my remit. But I well understand that it's vital that I collaborate closely with the Vice Chief's group as the ultimate joint capability authority, as there are some enabling functions that are not apparent in the process or fall between single service functions. As you know, I have announced that I will commit an Army battle group based on our 2nd Battalion and including a cross-section of combat and enabling capabilities from across Army to the development of a truly amphibious capability within the ADF. The training required to prepare Army to conduct combat operations as an integral part of a joint amphibious team is substantial and is not to be underestimated. New skills and training techniques will need to be developed and sustained, and importantly, a new culture and outlook for our role in the region grown and matured. In any event, the development path for Army and the ADF since the East Timor intervention in 1999 has assumed the existence of a rapidly deployable battle group reinforced by a follow-on multi-role combat brigade. The recent changes that I announced with regard to the transfer of a parachute capability from the conventional force to Special Operations Command and the allocation of a dedicated amphibious battle group conform perfectly with that strategic guidance. Army will have a robust force generation cycle for contingency and sustained operations built around a rapidly deployable battle group trained and enabled for entry operations across our region, intimately supported by special force operations. And we are well on the way to getting the fundamentals right. However, I do acknowledge that, like Navy, we are entering uncharted waters, no pun intended. From the outset, we, all three services, will need to carefully develop and formalise an unambiguous, robust and permanent command and control structure supported by doctrine to plan and command amphibious operations in all likely operational contingencies. Previously, we've been able to adapt rapidly and get it right on the night, as we did in East Timor and in the Solomon Islands. Our excellent people and our culture, a true joint culture, facilitated this, though it was a triumph of improvisation rather than professional mastery. My predecessor, Ken Gillespie, at this very conference in 2010, noted that the Australian Army had no standing commander landing forces, and nor was there a designated organisation to command and control amphibious training and operations. That deficiency has been rectified with the nesting of a dedicated command and control element within the deployable Joint Force headquarters in Brisbane, and it is a crucial development. Army and the ADF's doctrine and training centres need to now adapt to meet the needs of capabilities and roles that are upon us. Our culture needs to be expeditionary in nature, taking account of the new and significant force projection capability with a permanently embarked land combat force. The future generation of Army officers will be trained and exposed to amphibious operations from the outset of their careers as a central pillar to how the ADF will operate in the future. And this will require an agile and joint mindset that we cannot claim to possess across the entire force at this time. Likewise, we will be required to operate every one of our armoured and aviation platforms from the LHDs simultaneously and across the spectrum of threats that we may face. Our array of complex communications and surveillance systems must now be considered primarily within an amphibious environment. The logistic challenges of operations afloat are unique and substantial. Army needs to urgently come to grips with maintaining and sustaining a whole range of land equipment in a maritime setting. The Navy and our allies, in particular the United States Marines, have considerable expertise upon which to draw. Australian Army officers and senior NCOs are conducting training with our allies in the US and in the UK. We have not yet come to grips with the logistic demands of sea basing. This is unsurprising, as we've never been called upon to do it, but it will be essential to our ability to conduct operations from the sea, and it will entail a large amount of Army's inventory spending time afloat and being maintained and sustained accordingly. Our transition from the current training posture and culture will be difficult, but it is begun. It is absolutely necessary because an Australian maritime strategy demands it. A cohesive, joint approach focused on the geographic and demographic realities of our region is clearly articulated in the 2009 White Paper. To be credible, such a strategy must include an integral role for the elements of Australian land power if it is to be flexible, balanced, capable of dealing with diverse and unpredictable global and regional security requirements. The Australian Army is on board, partially embarked, but ready to play its part. And my thanks again to the Chief of Navy for providing me the opportunity to address such a large, diverse but distinguished body as is present here today. I can assure you that during my time as this period's Chief of Army that I am fully committed to the path that the ADF is now on, and I look forward to working with all three services, the Department of Defence and our coalition partners to develop meaningful regional and global defence and security into the future. Thank you.
I now invite Chief of Air Force to present his views.
Well, Ray, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for the invitation to address this Sea Power conference. It is a real pleasure for me, and hopefully I just bring a slightly different viewpoint. In the often misquoted words of Donald Thorne, Australia is a lucky country. We are lucky geographically, demographically, politically and economically. But to diverge from Donald Thorne's commentary on Australia in the 1960s, rather than rely on luck as a strategy, we underpin the security of our nation and its interests through the sustainment of a military force focused on the defence of Australia. that has been and continues to be our #1 national security priority. As the largest island nation on the planet, it comes as no surprise that our security and prosperity are inextricably linked to the sea, whether on it, below it, or above it. Hence, a maritime strategy underpins our approach to national security. I think, as the Chief of Navy described before, Australia's prosperity has long been tied to the strength of its Navy, its people, its capabilities and its professional excellence. The Navy's ability to secure our maritime approaches and sea lines of communication has been and continues to be fundamental to the maintenance of our way of life. The Royal Australian Navy has a rich history of fulfilling this mission, and it's one that they should be rightly proud of. Now, while our land is entirely surrounded by sea, it is also 100% covered by air. And this fact fundamentally influences our strategic approach to security. You didn't think I was going to talk about Navy the entire time, did you? Air, land and sea forces are, of course, the irreducible minimum components of our national security approach. But today I'm actually going to limit my comments to the interaction between our naval and air forces. Air Force's contribution to naval operations has historically and continues to be realised through the 4 key air power roles: intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, or ISR, strike, air mobility and control of the air. These are enduring and fundamental air power contributions to national security. They also underpin the ways and means that Air Force interacts and operates with Navy. The title for these roles may have changed over the years, but they encapsulate the core functions that air power has provided to military operations since military aviation was first developed as a significant form of warfare. Each role can support the many tasks that Air Force, Navy and Army have in the joint fight. And in fact, in many ways, the roles have a certain synergy to them. To conduct effective air mobility requires some degree of control of the air. Similarly, to establish control of the air may often require some sort of strike role. ISR is essential in all roles, but it itself needs a favourable air environment, and that needs to be established through some measure of control of the air. For these air power roles are ubiquitous, and in many ways they continue today as they always have. They complement the principal sea power roles of power projection, sea denial and sea control. We've all seen the word joint grow as a fashionable term since the 80s, but the reality is the forging of air and naval power has a long and cooperative history that can be traced back as far as World War I, with the very advent of air vehicles as instruments of war. And throughout World War II, I think a little known fact is that RAAF aircraft operated off Royal Australian Navy ships. And those aircraft were often flown by RAF pilots. They had Navy observers and gunners. And along with land-based aircraft, they escorted Australian convoys, they performed anti-submarine patrols, they flew many thousands of hours of air-sea rescue tasks. And as well as that, they conducted strikes on enemy vessels. They undertook long-range reconnaissance and surveillance operations in support of Australian and Allied naval task forces. The tradition of Air Force support to naval operations continued through the conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and during the long years of the Cold War. Maritime surveillance and anti-submarine warfare conducted by Sunderland and Catalina flying boats, Lincoln bombers, Lockheed Neptunes, P-3B and P-3C aircraft have been institutionalised elements of RAAF tasking for more than 70 years. In addition to these aircraft, alongside F-4 Phantoms, F-111s, F-18s, we've continued to maintain a maritime strike capability ready to contribute to any offensive or defensive tasks that the Royal Australian Navy may have been called upon to perform. The Chief of Navy spoke on the importance of a comprehensive maritime strategy to Australia's ongoing prosperity. The very large expanse of waters to our north, south, east and west, the vastness of our economic exclusion zone, the criticality of our oil and gas fields to our country's future economic future. In short, we need to remain committed to a maritime strategy. This will require air and naval power to be applied at a coordinated national effort in order to shape the maritime environment and deter any potential adversaries. Air Force is committed to supporting the full range of Australian naval activities, whether they are sea denial, sea control, border security, suppression of piracy, economic security zone patrols, or force protection operations. As with all elements of our Defence Force, the nature of the operation will determine the character of our contribution. However, as I think we've seen over the last 20 years, we rarely operate in a state of complete peace or total conflict. We need to recognise through experience that elements of the ADF need to be prepared to conduct both peace and warlike activities concurrently. Thus, while Air Force strike and air control activities are conducted primarily in the lead up and during a conflict, ISR and air mobility occur across the spectrum of conflict. The use of air to collect data and information for the development of intelligence was actually the first use of military aviation and continues to underpin much of our military effectiveness. Air Force views intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, or ISR, as an integrated concept to synchronise, prioritise and manage collection, analysis and processing activities. The vastness of our maritime environment presents unique challenges to Navy. The Air Force appreciates Navy's requirement to gain situational awareness of the operational context, as well as tactical information on offensive and defensive actions. The requirement underpins all joint maritime operations and drives our commitment to the delivery of timely ISR product. Specifically, I'm looking at the Dawn over-the-horizon radar network and our maritime patrol aircraft, the P3C. The P8 Poseidon, the planned replacement being acquired under Project Air 7000, along with its high-altitude, long-endurance, multi-role UAV, will continue to meet the increasing demands for maritime patrol and overwater ISR. I agree with Chief of Navy that the high end of Navy's contributions to the defence of Australia will rely on its ability to control the seas through its capital ships, submarines and support vessels. Protection of these naval task force elements will be a priority mission for the Air Force, and we've long contributed to that task through our maritime strike capability. From the early days of Sunderland flying boats through the F-111 to the present day F-18 Super Hornets and the AP-3C, we've demonstrated the capability to strike warships that threaten our naval task forces or our sea lines of communication. And we remain committed to that task with the acquisition of the P8 and JSF. Anti-submarine warfare has been a mission for the Air Force since World War II and remains so today. We recognise that anti-submarine warfare is a true joint enterprise encompassing a suite of capabilities open to both the Navy and Air Force. I think understandably much of our attention over recent years has been on the MEO and the surveillance of our northern approaches. This has drawn the focus away from this vital task. We're actually looking to revitalise this task and see the future very much involved in networking our new air and sea assets. These will be supported by our MRT tankers, our space-based assets, as well as leveraging the electronic capabilities of the AEW&C. The submarine remains a significant threat to the security in our maritime environment and therefore our national prosperity. ASW is a truly joint endeavour and needs to be at the forefront of military priorities if our maritime strategy is to remain relevant. A cornerstone of any military activity across the spectrum of conflict is our ability to move people and equipment. The Navy will have an unparalleled capacity in our Australian context to move a fighting force across large distances. The size and endurance of the new vessels that Navy will allow Navy to maintain a presence in the area of operations and conduct follow-on combat and sustainment activities. Air mobility through our C-17, C-130s and the future battlefield airlifter provides Air Force with the ability to move people and equipment across large distances relatively quickly. Not only do the air power characteristics of speed and reach complement the sea power traits of capacity and presence, they work in harmony to increase the effectiveness of each other. And if I was to give a couple of examples again, time and time again, Air Force and Navy have worked together. One of the critical ones was actually on Operation Falconer, where critical warfighting equipment was actually transferred from HMAS Manoora by C-130s around the area of operation. If we look at some of our humanitarian activities, humanitarian aid is often sea-lifted into port. For example, HMAS Kanimbla did that in Operation Tsunami Assist, and the Air Force moved a lot of that aid around in C-130s. In addition to Air Force air mobility providing logistics support to Royal Australian Navy vessels all around the globe, and that often encompasses critical components to enable repairs, aeromedical evacuations, or just the routine movement of people and equipment. Sea and air power combine to generate speed, reach, capacity and presence needed to support Australia's national security interests. Now, just as Sir Julian Kober's principle of control of the sea sets the foundation for sea power strategy, Air Forces place control of the air at the cornerstone of air power effects. I think both principles are based on the understanding that each domain is really not susceptible to ownership. We can control portions of them in time to achieve our objectives, like the security of a sea line of communication, but acknowledge that absolute command is not always practical. This position is really more prevalent given the scale of our air and sea approaches and the relative size of our Navy and Air Force. I think it's worthwhile to note that the last Royal Australian ship to be attacked by an enemy aircraft was HMAS Australia in the Philippines in 1945. Since that time, the Royal Australian Navy task groups operating in contested environments have enjoyed sufficient protection that no enemy air has had the ability to threaten their operations. But 67 years of history is not a reason for complacency. The Navy and the Air Force understand the risks of enemy air action on military and commercial shipping. This is why the Air Force is committed, absolutely committed, to the Joint Strike Fighter as the most effective control of the air capability that is available to Australia. And I think it's the reason the Navy is committed to the Air Warfare Destroyer as the most lethal combatant that Australia can acquire. But to be able to commit to operations, we need to be trained and ready. Thus, we'll continue to undertake exercises engaging not only with the Royal Australian Navy, but also our partner air forces and navies to maximise our interoperability and ensure air power's contribution to naval activities remains focused, relevant and effective. But the way we train is undergoing some fundamental changes. Gone are the days when training with Air Force meant a Macchi or Mirage conducting a mock attack or a simulated anti-ship missile, or a P3 conducting rigging runs or searches for submarine periscopes. Today and into the future, training with air power is more than an inject to fleet exercises or ship workup drills. It is a fundamental contributor to the full spectrum development of sea power capabilities. Training in anti-surface strike operations will involve the full range of Air Force and naval capabilities. Training needs to be focused on achieving joint effects with service needs leveraged off the outcomes. Now, I don't want anybody to misconstrue my comments. The Air Force will continue to remain fully committed to Navy training and accreditation requirements, but we need to put more consideration into the adage, we train as we fight. Thus, as air and sea power capabilities continue to evolve, so will our approach to training. We'll need to work more closely together to enhance our networking and improve our level of integration if we are to develop the effects required to support our nation's security and future prosperity. Perhaps the most significant surface combat capability the Navy will acquire in the next decade will be the Hobart Air Warfare Destroyer. The Air Force welcomes the introduction of the AWD because, as I indicated, control of the air is fundamental to all military operations. The AWD, with its Aegis weapon system, phased array radar and SMN6, make it the most lethal combat capability ever to leave an Australian port. And that's probably just as well, because advances in maritime attack aircraft and air-delivered munitions mean that it's getting a whole lot more dangerous out there in the seas. Therefore, the protection of the Naval Task Force from enemy air requires a defence in depth. The AWD will provide that inner core and a much better level of situational awareness than Navy's ever had before. The Air Force will provide AW&C, P8s, Super Hornets and JSF to contribute to that outer perimeter. The introduction of the LHDs, Canberra and Adelaide, and HMAS Jules will provide Australia with an evolutionary new amphibious capability. Now, while the Air Force only has 6 embarked personnel on the LHDs, they're JBACs or air traffic controllers, if the LHD is dispatched into an environment which is in any way contested, the full range of Air Force capabilities will be committed to protection of the task force and support for the entry operation. So while our physical presence embarked on the task force will be relatively small, I put to you that our presence in the battle space will be large. Because we operate in separate but overlapping domains, communications as long as command and control have always been perennial challenges. Air Force is fully committed to minimising any roadblocks that inhibit our ability to work seamlessly with Navy elements. Interoperability is a significant element of our acquisition strategy. It'll be crucial to our future joint effectiveness. Our Air Force maritime capabilities need to be networked to the naval task elements. The AEW&C, P8, JSF and MUS, along with our legacy maritime capabilities, need to be not only able to talk to naval assets, but they need to be networked and able to fight as an integrated group. I think if you want to have a look at our commitment to that, you only have to look at the crewing of our Wedgetail AEW&Cs. Back in the late 90s, when we were looking at the concept of operations for Wedgetail, we decided that we actually needed Navy on board those aeroplanes. And as the AEW&C now approaches its IOC, each one of the crews we've got has at least one Navy air intercept controller on board. I think that's absolutely critical to making sure that we've got that integration right. Now, a large part of our ability to network is dependent upon our exploitation of the space domain. Communications, ISR, navigation, timing are just a few of the areas supported by space. They've become crucial to each of the individual services and our joint combat effectiveness. The level of dependence is only set to increase in the future, thus our interest to develop a joint approach to the use of space. As I said before, coordinating command and control is a perennial challenge. As we transition new capabilities in each service and integrate these joint effects, our greatest challenge is not how to operate them, but how Air Force commands and controls our air power contributions to most effectively and efficiently meet the Navy component needs and the Joint Force Commander's requirements. Despite some name changes, the air power roles of ISR, strike, air mobility and control of the air have been and will continue to remain enduring functions that complement the Royal Australian Navy's principal missions. However, the character of Air Force's contribution will continue to evolve in response to the operational environment, Navy's requirements and technological advancements. Every capability that Air Force is bringing online over the next decade will enhance Air Force's contribution to naval activities, from the JSF through to the Wedgetail, the P8, KC-30 tankers, maritime unmanned aerial systems, and our Vigil Air Integrated Air Defence C2 system. Every emerging Air Force capability will increase our ability to support the Royal Australian Navy's operations. Air Force's air power is structured for both peace and conflict, and it stands ready to support the full range of Navy's contributions to Australia's national security and prosperity. Thank you.
We now have just over 15 minutes of question and answer time available. I'm just going to set some ground rules for the Q&As throughout the conference. Could you please identify yourself and the organisation to which you belong? Constrain yourself to a question rather than a discourse that involves multiple questions. And can we save comments for outside the auditorium on the exhibition hall floor perhaps, so that we can get the most out of these Q&A sessions. We should have some microphones available around the auditorium, and may I suggest that we make use in this particular Q&A of the presence of the Chief of Army and the Chief of Air Force, as Chief of Navy will be around most of the week. I invite your questions.
Good afternoon. David Ellery from the Canberra Times. My question is directed to the Chief of Air Force, and it follows the statements made by the Minister for Defence, Mr. Smith, in regard to the JSF yesterday. We have been told that the Air Force is still totally committed to the JSF. My questions are, is the Chief of Air Force confident that the program is tracking well in terms of time and cost? And are there any grounds for the fears expressed by the Minister that the deferral of purchases by the US government may drive up the cost of the Australian planes?
For sure, thanks, David. At the moment, I just still haven't read the Minister's comments, so that puts me probably at a slight disadvantage at the moment. But I'd like to talk probably a little bit about the JSF program as I see it at the moment. Like all development programs, especially with military aviation, there's a process of test and evaluation. And as you go through that process, you'll always find issues with the aircraft. There's certainly been issues with the JSF program. It was probably optimistic to start off with. But having had a look at this year or the previous year, now that they've got the majority of the test aircraft, my confidence is actually increasing at the program at the moment. I can certainly understand from the Minister's position. I think when you're looking at big programs like that, you've always got to be talk about them with a certain degree of caution. But from what I can see at the moment, the JSF is tracking well. I think this year will be the litmus test to see whether we have any more issues with it. But I think you've got to remember that we're really not looking for an IOC of these aeroplanes for probably about another 5 or 6 years. So I think we've got a bit of time to have a look at the program and see how it's going.
Down here at the front.
Vice Admiral Robin Dhawan, the Vice Chief of Naval Staff, Indian Navy. And my question is for the Chief of Navy, sir. With the recent commissioning of HMAS Choles and the impending induction of the Canberra-class LHDs, which would be the largest ships that the RAN has operated for some time since the Melbourne experience that you alluded to, are there any plans for induction of platforms which would enable the capability of fixed-wing deck-based operations or indeed UAV operations from the deck?
Thanks for that. I should probably flick that to the Chief of Air Force for an answer, but I will take that question. UAVs is something I think we need to do a lot more work on. We have, to be frank, I think we've only dabbled with UAVs so far, and I think we do need to ramp up our investigation of the potential of UAVs from not just from the LHDs but from all our platforms. As for fixed wing, we are not pursuing that. It is just not government policy. The Defence White Paper clearly laid out what the fighter force would be, and it was not to include a stable capability, and that's where we stand on that. And we haven't installed certain equipment in the LHD that would enable sustained operations of fixed-wing aircraft.
Durbidge, Navy retired. I have a question for Chief of Army, and within the context of the LHDs and your Army in the decades ahead, will there be a continuing role for heavy field artillery, 155mm and above, perhaps, and what I'll say is heavy armour battle tanks?
Yes. Indeed, we will transition in the space of the next few years to an artillery capability that is all 155. At the present time, we are introducing into service the towed 777s, and they are combined with our artillery, field artillery data system, providing a level of indirect fire support that the Army, the ADF, has never possessed. They're very successful. This year, government will consider another phase of Land 17, which is the replacement of our artillery systems, and will consider whether we will introduce into service a self-propelled howitzer. And I'm not able to comment on that at the moment because NSC has not looked at it. But that system too will be 155 if it was to be introduced. Now, 155 provides a capability that the smaller calibre artillery simply cannot, in terms of both firepower as well as precision. So we're very committed to that. In terms of the main battle tank, absolutely as well. This government, or the previous government, made the decision to replace Leopard with Abrams because they were convinced, as I am, that tanks save lives. That irrespective of where we employ our tanks in support of land forces, they make a telling difference. And I remain firmly committed to that. The Abrams is a wonderful piece of equipment that is being used very effectively at the moment within one armoured regiment. One of the things we're looking at under Plan Bathsheba is whether we actually, without increasing the number of tanks in Army, nest our tank capability in more than one brigade. And that is a serious study. I think it's probably very much an example of how seriously we weight our faith in terms of what the Abrams and a tank capability can do for land forces. All systems, be they the 777, or should there be a self-propelled capability within Army, and certainly Abrams, are capable of being carried on the LHDs and indeed on the ship-to-shore connectors that will service the land force from those LHDs. So I think, in answer to your question, while I answered very briefly yes, I've given an explanation that hopefully underpins that.
Lieutenant Andrew Watts, Sea Power Centre. My question is for the Chief of Army and the Chief of Navy. To what extent will the Combined Battle Group receive Navy-centric training such as combat survivability and survival at sea, and what training infrastructure that Navy currently possesses for those fields be augmented and upgraded?
Well, the bottom line is that with a permanently embarked force, they'll need to be trained as any naval member of the ship's company will be, or any Air Force member of the ship's company. So I think that's a given. That will add some complexity to the training equation, but we're not going to we're not going to compromise on the training standards across the ship. As for infrastructure dimensions of that, I'll probably defer to the Chief of Army on that.
Oh, I'm sorry, are you referring to the infrastructure related to force structure and force development issues within Army or on board ship?
I relate to such as the School of Many S's and for the training of damage control and the amount of training that embarked forces, such the 2 battalion amphibious group will receive when they're going to be operating on these vessels on such a large scale and such a large period of time.
Well, as Ray has said, we will have to be involved with all of the requisite training to ensure that the embarked force is able to operate for a protracted period should it be required while on board. That is a particular capability that we don't have resident in Army at the moment, and why I've made the decision to nest, at least for an interim period, the development of an amphibious capability from Army in one battle group. I don't think that we know boats at the moment. We Army have been getting on and off naval vessels since Federation. I have spent, as an infantry officer, more time at sea than I ever would have chosen to when I joined a land force. So I think, I understand something of the complexity here, and we will do everything that we need to. I might just say, though, that while that is a challenge, for me, it's not the greatest. The soldiers that form part of the landing force will be trained, obviously, to the best that the ADF can take them to. The real challenges for Army, I think, are in terms of fully understanding command and control of landing forces and indeed landed forces from a headquarters that may remain embarked for a period of time. We need to understand our role in joint fires. We need to understand very much the complexity that will be apparent when we operate numerous helicopter types from the LHDs as part of an amphibious task force. And we'll need to understand the logistic issues that will apply to maintaining Army inventory while embarked at sea. All of those areas are going to require dedicated training. There is already training establishments given over to amphibiosity within the ADF, but I would describe them as dedicated but relatively rudimentary with regard to where the capability will go in the future, and we will be building on those. That's been part of the work that the JASSET has been doing in Army and Navy headquarters. But I think we need to go further, and there is a training needs analysis that has been underway for some time now across particularly Army and Navy to ensure that we tick all the boxes that will be required if we are able to operate safely at sea and effectively.
We have time for perhaps one more question.
Commodore Samet, Royal Australian Navy. I was interested in the Chief of Air Force's comments about the need for an ADF capability concerning ASW, and I thought I might ask you, sir, as well as Chief of Navy, what your thoughts are on how we might develop an ASW capability that is truly ADF-wide and recognises the importance of theatre ASW as a tenet of our defence posture.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you want to just take my comments, a lot of the P3 force has been committed to border operations and the MEO. So that part of it, our ability to sort of train on ASW has been limited over the last few years. So, we need to get that back to a higher level. Also, I think with the introduction of the Romeos, that inner sanctum around the task force. We need to be able to work together with those two platform types, as well as develop, our ability to work with our own submarines as well. I think if you look over the last 10 years, there's been lots of reasons why we haven't been able to do that quite as well as we would like. But hopefully, looking into the future, we'll be able to put more time and effort into that. One of the things that I think Chief of Navy will look at as we look at this force structure review is just look at those the number of P8s that we've got. Whether that's enough is a question that we need to have a look at in that force structure review.
Just quickly, Greg, before we run out of time, I think one of the keys is understanding what are the components of the force that actually conduct the ASW mission. I think within our frigate mentality, we think of frigates, we think of helicopters, we think of P3s. We don't think of submarines as being a key part of the ASW mission. The other aspect I think that's important is the integration from a command and control perspective of the theatre ASW picture. Now, I think the Joint Operations Command construct in the longer term probably provides us with a way to develop that. And I think that's down track considerably at the moment.
All right, that completes the first session. Thank you very much for your attendance. And as I said in opening remarks, it's very rare to have all three service chiefs in the same place and available for comment like this outside of Russell. So please join me in thanking our three guests.
Thank you.
The next session commences at 13:50.